Imagine Europe, mid-14th century. The streets of Paris, Florence, London. Instead of the usual noise of the markets, there is silence, broken only by moans and the bells of funeral processions. Houses are closed, doors marked with black crosses. People drop dead in the middle of the squares. And lie there. For days. This is not a metaphor, it is reality. Cities were turned into mass graves. The plague swept across the continent, and in a few years it wiped out between a third and a half of Europe's population. According to various estimates, between 75 and 200 million people were wiped off the face of the earth. And here's the worst part, it wasn't just a disease. It was a demonstration of how easily the civilized world could crumble before our eyes. A chronicler from Florence wrote, "This death was so contagious that even touching the clothes or simply looking at a sick person seemed deadly. But wait, this is only the beginning. Because what the plague did to the human body looks like a horror scenario written by nature itself. Do you know what the plague did to people? It turned the body into a veritable biological weapon. At first, there was a mild fever. It seemed like a common cold. But within a day or two, huge, painful tumors grew under the armpits and on the neck. They were called buboes. They were hot, swelled to the size of an apple, and then burst open. The skin was covered with dark spots. The limbs turned black, and fingers died right before your eyes. It was no wonder that the epidemic was called the Black Death. Imagine, you are walking down the street, and next to you is a person who is still breathing and talking, but already gives the impression that they are on the verge of life and death. Chroniclers wrote, the patient's breath smelled so bad that it was as if they had already died. And worst of all, these people were contagious even when they looked relatively healthy. It was enough to sit next to them or simply breathe the same air. Imagine a bomb walking around the city, and you don't know when it will explode. That's what a person infected with the plague was like. But believe me, that's not the worst picture. Because the body is just the beginning. The real horror began when entire cities gradually became cemeteries. What happened in medieval cities resembled a real apocalypse. Imagine the narrow streets of Florence or London. Stone houses, markets, workshops. And suddenly they turned into a solid morgue. Corpses lay right on the streets. There were so many of them that gravediggers couldn't physically keep up with digging graves. People were thrown into ditches, pits, even wells. The overfilled earth could no longer absorb death. Dogs and pigs roamed the streets and dragged human bones around in broad daylight. And you know what? People didn't even chase them away. Because the fear of infection was stronger than any other feeling. A chronicle from Florence states, no one had the courage to even touch a dead relative. Neighbors did not visit each other. If someone was sick, they were left in their house and the door was locked from the outside. People died alone. Venice, Paris, London, all these cities looked more like scenes from disaster movies. Only this was reality, and it was impossible to escape it. But the horror was not limited to cities. Even more gruesome scenes were unfolding at sea. From time to time, ships washed up on the shores without a single living soul on board. The sails were torn, the deck was neglected, and inside were only the bodies of sailors. Entire crews died on the way, and ships drifted for weeks in the open sea. People called them ghost ships, symbols that death knows no boundaries. And who do you think dared to enter the infected houses, count the bodies, and try to help, in any way? Yes, it was the legendary plague doctors. But they looked more like they were scaring people than giving them hope. Can you imagine a medieval doctor? Forget it. The image of them was more like demons than saviors. A long black cloak, gloves, boots, and most importantly, a mask with a giant beak. A real bird's beak sticking out of their face. From the outside, it looked as if aliens from hell had entered the city. They put herbs, spices, vinegar, anything with a strong smell, in the beak. Because they believed that the plague spread through contaminated air, the so-called miasma. And if you inhaled rosemary or lavender, death would supposedly pass you by. They carried wooden staffs in their hands. Not for magic, but to avoid touching the sick and keep them at a distance. The appearance of these doctors frightened children so much that historians believe it later became one of the prototypes for the image of the terrifying clown in culture. But here's an important clarification. Such costumes only appeared en masse in the 17th century, after the Black Death. In the 14th century, they were not widespread, but over time, the image of the doctor with a beak became so ingrained in culture that it became the main symbol of all plague epidemics. And now the main thing, they could hardly help. They did not treat, but simply counted the sick and the dead. At best, they gave advice such as, do not breathe deeply. Avoid bathing. Drink wine. Plague doctors became a symbol of the epidemic. But not as saviors, but as a living reminder, if you see this black silhouette with a beak, death is near. But the worst thing was not even the doctors. The worst thing was what people did themselves, out of panic and despair. When the world collapses, people stop thinking logically. And in the 14th century, there was not much logic to begin with. The plague was perceived as God's punishment. And if God punishes, then you have to pray, or punish yourself even more. This is how the so-called brotherhoods of flagellants appeared. Imagine hundreds of people walking through the streets, singing psalms and whipping themselves. They believed that their own pain would appease God and stop the plague. Of course, the disease did not stop. But the fanatics continued to walk through the cities, resembling living punishment. But there was something even worse. People began to look for those to blame. And they found them in the Jews. Rumors spread that they were poisoning the wells. The result was pogroms, mass murders, and thousands of innocent people died simply because the crowd was looking for someone to take revenge on. Witches also fell victim to the mob. Any woman who knew something about herbs or simply behaved inappropriately could become a victim. Now, a little bit about medieval medicine. Ready? Here are some tips from doctors of that time. Drink melted gold, yes, literally. Sit by the fire to drive out the disease with heat. And most importantly, don't wash. It was believed that bathing opened the pores to infection. Can you imagine? People who already bathed once a year were now afraid of water altogether. The world was going mad. But this was not yet the fall, only the beginning. Because the plague not only killed bodies, it destroyed the very foundation of society. The plague didn't just mow people down, it destroyed the very fabric of society. Monasteries were emptied. Monks, who were supposed to pray for the salvation of souls, were dying by the hundreds. Some monasteries simply disappeared because there were no monks left alive. Entire villages disappeared from the map. Fields were overgrown with weeds. No one harvested crops or tended livestock. The land that was supposed to feed people was turning into a wasteland. Now imagine the laws, morals, traditions, everything that sustained life in medieval Europe. It was literally falling apart before our eyes. The chronicler wrote, "Brothers abandoned brothers, parents abandoned children. The fear of death proved stronger than any family ties. Families fell apart, marriages were abandoned. A wife could run away, leaving her husband in a fever. And a husband could close the door on his sick wife, because otherwise he would doom himself. The laws also ceased to function. Judges, clerks, guards, all were dead or had fled. When a third to half of society died out, the very meaning of the rules of the game disappeared. Imagine a world where death takes every other neighbor. Where there is no God, no law, no morality to protect you. It was not just a plague. It was the collapse of civilization. But even in this darkness, there were details so incredible that it is hard to believe this is history and not a horror movie script. Think you've heard the worst? Hold on, because the story gets even crazier. In London, the cemeteries were so overcrowded that people said that even after the epidemic had receded, the city still seemed to breathe the shadow of death for a long time. In Paris, there were up to 1,000 burials a day. Just imagine this conveyor belt. The priests couldn't keep up with reading prayers, gravediggers threw bodies in layers, and in just a few weeks, coffins became a luxury available only to the rich. Several centuries passed, but the shadow of the Black Death did not leave Europe. In the 18th century, Paris faced a new problem. The cemeteries were so overcrowded that bodies began to seep into the basements of houses and even into wells. The authorities found a solution. Millions of bones were transferred to old quarries. This is how the famous catacombs of Paris appeared, a city of the dead under the city of the living. And now, the most terrifying part. Witnesses wrote that sometimes people were buried alive. They were thrown into a pit with corpses just because they looked dead. A sick person would lie there with a fever, and that was it, they would cover him with earth. The treatment methods also deserve a separate horror movie. One of the popular methods was to apply live chickens to the buboes. It was believed that the bird would suck out the poison. It is not difficult to guess how much this helped. Some sources even mention that people were advised to drink their own urine, as it was believed to have cleansing properties. It is clear without explanation how much this helped, but in their desperation, people resorted even to such advice. And now another incredible fact. After the epidemics in Europe, the so-called mummy powder became fashionable. Mummies were brought from Egypt, ground up, and sold as a cure for all diseases. It was drunk, added to ointments, and even to cosmetics. Imagine, death became a commodity, and people were treated with the dead. Death also became a science and even a spectacular show. In England, after epidemics, the bodies of executed criminals began to be given to doctors. They were dissected publicly in front of crowds. This marked the beginning of anatomical theaters, places where death became a spectacle and the human body became a teaching aid. In short, medieval medicine turned out to be even more terrifying than the disease itself. And here is the result. Between 75 and 200 million people died in a few decades. No war, no conqueror could compare to what a single bacterium did. But the story did not end there. Despite all the horrors, humanity survived. And even more than that, the world after the plague was never the same again. So, let's summarize. The Black Death wiped out between 75 and 200 million people. Between a third and a half of Europe's population simply disappeared. Entire villages were deserted, cities resembled cemeteries, and culture, religion, and the economy were devastated. It seemed like the end of the world. But history had a different ending. Because along with the dead, the old order also disappeared. Feudalism, which had held Europe together for centuries, began to crumble. The land was deserted, and suddenly the work of peasants became more valuable. People began to demand better conditions, and the lords had to give in. The church lost some of its power. Because if prayers cannot stop the plague, then perhaps the answers should be sought elsewhere. This is how skepticism began, which would later explode into the Reformation. Even attitudes toward death changed. People began to live faster, more boldly, because they understood that tomorrow they might not be here. And this new outlook on life fueled a renaissance of culture, science, and art. The Black Death was the most terrible catastrophe of the Middle Ages, and at the same time a springboard into a new era. And you know what's strange? Today, we are also trying to defeat death. Some freeze their bodies in the hope that science will be able to resurrect them. Others create digital memorials to live in the virtual world even after death. It turns out that the fear of death is the only pandemic that lasts forever. So the main lesson here is simple and cruel at the same time. Humanity is extremely fragile. But even more impressive is how resilient it is. Because even after the apocalypse, when the streets of Europe became mass graves, people still rose up. And from the ruins, a new world was born.